This portion of River Revival brought to you in part by the Friends of the Minnesota Valley, working together since 1982 to protect and enhance the lower Minnesota River and the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge.
There'll be plenty of time to visit with the candidates.
It's August in 2010. There's a gubernatorial candidate forum at Farmfest near Redwood Falls.
Everybody on Main Street, Minnesota knows that the health of Minnesota's economy depends on the health of agricultural economy.
Indeed, almost 4/5 of the land in the Minnesota River Valley is devoted to agriculture.
We're very dependent as a society worldwide on the food that's produced in the Minnesota River Basin.
Row crops and livestock generated more than $13 billion in 2009. Agriculture is Minnesota's second largest industry and accounts for 1/5 of our jobs.
The Minnesota River Basin up into the Red River Valley, there's what I would call the modern day Fertile Crescent, where we've got a combination of the right soils and climate and rainfall.
Prime agricultural soil with not a lot of stones. It also holds water. It's a glacial lake clay and silt, so you have to tile it to farm it.
Much of our drainage systems that have been installed are nothing more than stormwater removal systems, very similar to what most cities have. It's just a way of moving water off the landscape to make the land tillable.
But the faster flow of water from tile drainage has made farming the floodplain risky. Don Halverson used to farm the river bottoms near Montevideo. He experienced firsthand what happens when tiling increases on land upstream.
In '52, Benson area, a lot of the farms were half sloughs. That's when they started building ditches and draining all that, and then all that water comes down, and that's why it floods every year. It got so that it didn't pay to put in a crop anymore. This year was all farmland.
So Don Halverson decided to quit farming the floodplain and put his land in a conservation program.
Make it a wetlands. This way, when the floods, the flood water settles in here and saves it from going into the river or down to the Mississippi. And now see what it looks like. It's a sanctuary for birds and raising fish, deer, or turkeys, or pheasants, or ducks, or if you can hunt it all, you should be able to get something. It's worth a lot to me for the river, for my grandchildren and my neighbors.
In the years since he quit farming the floodplain, Halverson and his neighbors have continued working to improve water quality in the river. In 1992, Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson created a Citizens Advisory Committee to find ways to make the Minnesota River fishable and swimmable.
The Citizens Advisory Committee, painstakingly over the course of 2 years, put together a very comprehensive set of recommendations for the state of Minnesota to follow, what we call almost the 10 Commandments of cleaning up the Minnesota River. First of them was the river needed to have its natural floodplain restored, because there was really no reason to be farming in that floodplain. This is floodland, it's not cropland. So 4 of us from the Citizens Advisory Committee flew out to Washington, D.C.
And the availability of the federal dollars to focus on a watershed and try to make a major impact in improving water quality and habitat in that watershed was available through this Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program.
About a month later, the federal government put about $167 million up on the table as a little incentive for the state of Minnesota to get this cropped floodland out of production.
But the state needed about $80 million in matching funds to get the federal money.
Governor Carlson and his staff put this at the top of their agenda.
And we marched a lot of farmers up to the Capitol saying, we want this. They don't want to be in the floodplain farming.
Minnesota Farmers Union, the Farm Bureau, corn growers, soybean growers, pork producers, all of these groups in the end were supportive. The rare sort of once in a lifetime.
We're talking about 100,000 acres of floodland along the Minnesota River and its tributaries, which was taken out of production in the course of less than 2 years.
I think it was both citizens coming together with government, and it formed a partnership that I think will have a lasting impact on Minnesota.
5 to 10 years after that CREP program was in place, you could visibly see the difference in the Minnesota River. Many of the fish species that are sensitive to those high rates of sediment have returned. A lot of it had to do with crep. Crep was huge.
Your committee was the first to break the hostility, if you will, between urban and non-urban on the environmental issues. And I think through your committee, which was representative of the totality of the state, and the coming together of the various agencies, I think it started to build bridges. And I think those bridges are frankly permanent.
And a great ending to a super project now that is being replicated across the United States. We did a nice job on that, but we got a lot of work to do yet.
Like everyone else, farmers want clean water too, and they're showing us new ways to grow food without making the water dirty.
This is the pond my dad put in 1973. This was a big ravine. We made an earthen dike, and it catches all the silt and everything before it hits the river.
In picking sites, that's definitely something to look at.
And he carries on the conservation ethic he learned from his father.
And I was at a meeting Leonard Binstock put on about ways that tile lines were going to be changing.
Today is the first day for building a wood chip bioreactor at the edge of Carl's Fields. With cost-share funds, county, state, and federal agencies are working with Carl to make the water cleaner coming from his drain tile.
It's a relatively simple concept. It's capturing water from tile lines long enough so that it breaks down nutrients before it gets discharged to the stream.
You have to maintain our ground so that is beneficial to everybody.
The Minnesota comes south.
Audrey Arner surveys her farm on the blufflands of the valley near Lac qui Parle. She and her husband, Richard Handine, quit farming corn and soybeans way back in the 1970s.
We had been spending time with farmers who were affiliated with the Land Stewardship Project and the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota, and many of those mentors affected our decision-making to manage grasslands. In doing that, we have learned to take the lesson from the Great Prairies, which has been to perennialize and to diversify.
They think of their farm as a water catchment zone, and they built a dam to hold the stormwater and make a pond.
Since we have perennialized the landscape, the springs run year-round. There's just less volume of water in the stream, even after a high rainfall event, because we're holding more of it. We don't apply phosphorus. We keep our animals some distance from the waterways so that much of the nutrient that comes from them is absorbed in the paddocks. So that's pretty darn clear water by the time it hits the culvert.
Audrey says the water in their pond is swimmable and fishable.
Most farmers love the land, and they may not all understand ecosystem processes in the same way, but I think it's really important to listen to one another with an open heart, to foster biological diversity, to cycle nutrients in a way that doesn't contaminate the river, and to effectively conserve our precious water resources.